sustainability. Please, Yvonne, can start.
Okay, thanks a lot. So good afternoon to everyone and to people online. So I have to say time. So thanks a lot for your attention. No, I'm going still to do the presentation. So the topic I'm going to present is, as it has been introduced, the processing. And this work was conducted with Gideon from NRI and with Gregory Komada from the Food and Research Institute of Ghana. So I think that it's important to begin with some definitions. We take the processing definition as the activities that are going to change the product state, the physical state of the product, to make it more desirable or viable. And of course, processing is also going to make the lifespan of the product be a little longer and avoiding losses of the product. So one important hypothesis that we had in the synthesis is that processing is going to be value-added possibility, but not only by the transformation itself, but also for the whole value chain. So we keep the idea of VCA4D of being transdisciplinary. So we look at the economic, social, and environment impacts of processing stage, but also the farm level and the other investment services in delivery and logistics. So next, please. The questions and issues that we try to answer with this synthesis and that are going to structure my presentation are: what are the economic contribution of processing for a sustainable and inclusive growth in the value chains, the social effects of processing, the environmental damages, where they come from, and how they are interrelated with the processing stage, and finally, the policy implications of all the findings that we had. So next, please. So we had selected 8 different studies. And here the idea was to represent the diversity of VCA4D methodology. You can see that we have staple crops and export crops, because here there's also a question about the relevance to compare different products in different countries, a question that was raised this morning. And we try to deal with this by differentiating the staple crops and the export crops. So we have maize in Nigeria and Zambia, sorghum in Ghana, and other export crops, especially in Latin America and also in Africa. You see that most of countries are in Western and Southern Africa and in Latin America. So one interesting thing here that we want you to see is the contribution of smallholders to the primary output is higher for staple crops, and but it's quite important also in export crops. And another thing that is important is to see the contribution of large-scale processors and producers to the export crops. Next, please. So to present the different findings, here you have the contributions of processors in the selected value chains. So you see that the contribution to value added in staple crops, it's more important than export crops. And this is probably because most of the export crops are in a raw material form, that in the value chain we review. Most of the time, the processing is in the staple ones. So we can also see that the representation of the figure, the share of total crop output processed. We can also see that the contribution to the processors to the total value chain, and it's linked to this, it's more important in staple crops, and that surprisingly, the average contribution to the public finances was higher for staple crops, probably because most of the processing of export crops are made in the importation country. And of course, with no surprise, logically, the contribution to net foreign exchange generation is higher for export crops, and because export crops. So next, please. And if we look a little more deeply in the value added, so we see, and you know already that we have a lot of indicators in the economic analysis. We keep the value added, and we see that, of course, the export crops have a higher value per ton, but Gideon make a work when using the incremental value added to compare. So the idea is that this is the ratio of the total output, and we take into account the different, it's already in the indicators also VCA4D, when you take all the value added during the different stages in the value chain. And if I don't exactly say the good thing, Gideon, you can just correct me. And so the idea is that the ratio, you have the average of the incremental value added, and then finally, even if the transformation itself, it's going to make and give you a better value added. Finally, in the export crops, where the processing is quite low, we have a value added that it's important because it comes from other actors. So it's interesting that this presentation comes after the previous one, because we were talking about that, the midstream, the processors, the other actors. That finally, and that was something important that we found in this review. So it seems that the increased activities by providers compensate the loss of value of processing in the export crops. So next, please. When we look at the social effects of the studies, we saw that processing, especially in staple crops, usually it's made by formal, so the large and medium scale are usually high or have usually more formal level than small scale, which are mostly informal. So from the social point of view, we compare this criteria, and we have the formal processing and the effects, the social effects that are linked to it, with limited direct rural employment. So it seems that even if the income is higher at this level, there is no improved in terms of the number of workers. Usually, in the formal processing, we have better good food and health safety standards that are respected. And of course, it offers a more attractive remuneration, which is usually regulated. And as we saw in the previous presentation, we saw also that in the results, the supply chains that are linked to formal processors creates opportunities for sustainable access to inputs and credit by smallholders. So in the other hand, we have the social impact of informal processing. And an important thing is that we saw that informal processing was more inclusive in terms of generation of income, and especially for rural and low-income households. but there is major food safety challenges because of the poor state processing equipment. So we have more risk for the workers. The process that they're exposed to significant health and safety risk. And there is also risk about the insecurity of the remuneration and the employment because of the informality. And that is another point that I think that it is going to be discussed, the way in which we take into account the familiar work that is not always quantified. And usually, of course, in informal sectors, we don't have contracts, and that is a barrier to enter and to get credits that can be used for the inputs. So another link to the previous presentation. And so next. Now, for an environmental point of view, I have to start with something that I think that you have already all heard about from a practitioner of life cycle assessment, and is that the function is very important, and we cannot compare a lot of different things. So taking into account these limits, and here we try to compare. So I present the different category of damages, the different stages. What I call the stages is the processing, the primary production, and the trade. That is all the midstream, unless the processing, of course. And here you have differentiation of staple crops and non-staple crops. So there is a huge variability of results. That is the representation of the lines. But we can, even though, see that in the case of staple crops, the primary production is the main contributor for the 3 areas of protection, even if it can be a switch when processing used an important amount of energy. That export crops, major contributors are the trade and the processing stages, in particular for human health and resource depletion. So if we want to reduce the environmental footprint of value chain where processing is a very important part, we have to act to face different challenges at the different stages in the agricultural production to improve the yields. And even if we have to take into account that there is a quality issues. Okay, thank you. Processing stages, in particular, will be the efficiency of energy, and we have to improve also the efficiency of transport and the way in which we assess transport in VCA4D. Because, for example, we don't take into account the transport of export crops, and this is a very important thing from an environmental point of view. Next, please. So this is a finding that is quite transversal because it's about the technology efficiency, and that is very important in processing. So the main contribution of environmental impact are the energy resources. Gideon showed a photo about how pito is made, and we have a lot of problems with the wood is used, about deforestation. And now in the Willkommen page, we talk about the problems of energy. So it's a very huge challenge that we have. There seems to be a gap of efficiency of transformation processes between artisanal and industrial units that, as we have already said, are quite linked to formality. So maybe better working conditions. And the problem that smaller scale processors relied on old and inefficient technology, which creates pollutions of like noise, particulate matter, greenhouse emissions. And here we have another interesting link that is from the economic point of view. This old and efficient technology increased the total operation cost. So better processing will be with better technology will help the sanitary conditions for the producer, from the consumers, and also the food security and the food safety. Next. So, which are the main implications of all our findings for decision making? Just to summarize the different findings, is that processing is not only contributing to incremental value added, but by the transformation itself, but for other services that are involved, that the role of value added is more important in staples than in export crops. We take into account, when we take into account the processing. So, but, and this is maybe something that can help the decision makers, that sometimes that the compensation of in the value and the generation of the incremental value added for the whole chain could be interesting in promoting, or instead of trying to upscale the export processed products. Here we have another point of discussion. It's about the fact that if we export raw material, we have to import maybe processed products, and that can have environmental issues. So we have to see. Important thing also that is related to previous presentation also is the importance of informal actors, because they seems to be more inclusive, and but they need to be guided. This is quite a difficult question because it's difficult to institutionalize, but we can not see the importance of these actors. Next. So other evidence are as I already said, I'm going to be brief. So the energetic sources and the efficiency of technologies. We see that for staple crops and also for some export crops, the main hotspot affecting the ecosystem is the agricultural production. So in several cases, even if we want to strengthen the processing value chain, one of the first action should be to enhance the production. And this implies something that is not always easy in the field, is the synergy between the ministries of agriculture and industry. So it's important to help to give access to cleaner production technologies, what implies, of course, finances and credit. And as I already said, to take into account the potential impact of transport for international trade, because right now only 2 studies try to make scenarios with including this, and the environmental impact is like multiplied even by 30. So it's something that is very important to take into account. So that brings me, I think it's the last. Yes, 50.